What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be covering some of the games that I had while I was playing the True Draco Zoo Deck, just to show you guys what it's like to play the deck, a little bit of a feel of how this deck works. Overall, I don't think it's too complicated with the plays that you can do. This deck has a very simple playstyle like Zoo, where like the Zoo cards you set up, you chill. With the Draco cards you take like advantageous trades and free pluses. And then there's a little bit of sequencing that you can do, but it's nothing too complicated. I really think anyone can kind of just jump into this deck, and after you've learned what all your cards do, because there's not really like any crazy sequencing that needs to be done. Starting off with this first game, we're going first. We opened a pretty decent mix of cards. We have access to our Zoo engine, and we have access to our Draco cards as well. We have an early game diagram, which really sets us up really nicely for the rest of the game. If your opponent doesn't out this card early on, it just snowballs you advantage every turn. And as you saw, the diagram popping the tanky is excellent synergy with this deck. So now we set 2 True Draco cards here. We set the first on the field, then activate Heritage, and then we activate Heritage's effect to get an additional draw. We use Heritage's effect to get a Tribute Summon, so that we Tribute Summon our Dynamite Knight, the True Draco Slaying King, or the True Draco Slayer. And why I sequenced it this way is I wanted to tribute the Disciples, because it was basically a dead card. I wanted to keep the tanky for next turn, because it's a good Zoo follow-up play, where the Disciples, it'll take a couple turns for that to turn on. And what that'll allow us to do is with Heritage, get 1 free additional draw this turn, while still giving us, because we were going to need to use that additional normal summon anyways, might as well get a free cycle. And then also we put the Dynamite on the field first, so if our opponent has something like a Max C that they did shotgun at the beginning of the turn, we'll actually be able to get a +1 off of them activating Max C. Because the Dynamite's already on the field, if they Max C us, we get to activate his effect to get a trap. So we activate the effect of Heritage here to draw a card, and then we go into our Zoo stuff. I think I do a little bit of a misplay here in this replay. I actually go into Drytron with 3 materials underneath. It really should have just been 2. That way we play around Nibiru as well. There was no reason to play into Nibiru here with this hand. Just kind of would have been better to sit back and chill. And you see we drew the Forbidden Droplets, which will be very powerful if our opponent activates an effect, because we'll be able to set a True Draco trap from the deck with our Dynamite. And then also we just have a Drytron set up. So it's a very basic board. We have follow-up for next turn in the form of Fire Formation Tenki. We have the diagram that needs to be dealt with, because diagram plus Tenki gets us back into our plays. And then we have a Drytron to pop one of their cards. We have a Dynamite that's going to get us potentially multiple cards, 1 on their turn, maybe 1 on my turn. And then the Heritage as well can get additional resources. And then the Forbidden Droplets, which is really cool with this deck, because if we were to activate something like an Apocalypse from deck, we can Droplets send the Apocalypse and then pop a card on our opponent's field, or we can Apocalypse pop the Heritage to pop a back row, have our opponents attack and defense if they try to pressure over our Drytron or our Dynamite, and then still also Droplets send the Apocalypse to get the additional pop. So overall, we're kind of in a good spot. We have some good resources set up that'll flow into the next turn well. And in this game, I am actually playing against a Live Twin deck. I think this was Live Twin Unchained. They don't really see any Unchained stuff. They just see a bunch of Live Twins. So on their first activation, I am going to get a trap from deck. One thing that's maybe worth considering is holding off on using the Draco Slay, the True Draco effects to search cards or add cards until after your opponent commits a monster to the field. And the main reason for that is so that you play around Gamma. And a lot of the times, there's no reason to not play around Gamma. So like, there's cases where you can. If I want to be able to maybe pop the first card they play on summon, and if they don't activate effects, then maybe you do it here. But I know how the Live Twin deck works, so he searches out his Lilla Treat, and he special summons Kiss Kill Frost. So he has a ton of extenders in hand, right? So he goes into his plays, he makes Link Disciple, which is one of the optional engines you can play in the Live Twin deck, and then into Devotee. We kind of have to use our Drytron pop here on our Disciple, because the Disciple is going to tribute the Devotee, get him a draw, get him advantage, and we don't want that. We want to just kind of deny that, because now he's in a position where he has to take his 2 and link them both into a Lilla, or a Kiss Kill, I'm sorry, he can't make Lilla here. And then when he Kiss Kill activates its effect, we can chain Droplets to both negate the effect of Kiss a Kill, and then also at resolution, we're going to pop the Kiss a Kill. And then because of the way that Treat works, is that it requires you to have a Kiss a Kill on the board. And so with that, he's going to kind of surrender because we were able to effectively use our 2 pops that we had and the 1 negate that we had to stop his follow-up plays, even though he had like ample extenders in hand. That's just to kind of go to show you the very basic like turn 1 setups that you get with this board. If you see Dynamite and Trident, you can get to 2 pops pretty easily. Moving on to the second replay, we also here have another good access to Zoo cards. Here, this replay is going to show off how you can go into your Draco's Future play with your Zodiac cards. So we discard Thoroughblade or Ram with Thoroughblade, and then we're going to go through our steps to make our True Draco Future. And what's cool about this is if you get Nibiru'd here, if you see my hand, it's a handful of True Draco cards. So if our plays on our Zoo stuff get stopped, we actually have a pretty powerful follow-up for what we can do. We can set the Disciples, activate Heritage, tribute over the Disciples to summon the Majesty's Maiden. Heritage effect will draw us a card, and then we can set the Apocalypse, and so we have a tribute summon on their turn, a search with Majesty Maiden, and then the Heritage as well. So even if they were to do something like Nibiru us here, or Maxi us even, we have the ability to still end on a very strong recursive board that they'll need to out all the cards on. So here we go into our Draco Future play, end on Ram and Draco Future. And then I think additionally I'm going to tribute summon for Majesty Maiden so that we have we can get access to Ignis and Dynamite on the follow-up turns. So we're going to activate the Disciples here, tributing off the Tanky, really cool interaction with this deck, and then pass it over to our opponent. This is my opponent, I'll be frank, doesn't play the best here. So on the early part, we Majesty Maiden, get a search. He Ash Blossoms to deny the advantage. My opponent is playing Sky Striker, and I think if a lot of you guys are running into Sky Striker on the ladder, this actually has a really good matchup against Striker. This doesn't necessarily show off all the strong points, because the opponent here doesn't play the greatest. As you saw, he just Lightning Stormed my attack position monsters. I don't think he read the Utopic Draco. I was really thinking he was gonna go for the back row, but he didn't. He went for the front line. But in theory, this has a good striker matchup because you contribute over your spells and traps, or your spells to pop their back row and like clear their cards for free. Trident pops the multi-roll, which really stops their advantage gain engine. Draco Future is fantastic against striker because if they don't see the anchor and they go into something like Hayate, they'll attack, use Hayate's effect, and then you can negate it with Draco Future. This has happened to me multiple times against Striker, where I activate Draco Future in response to their Hayate, and I think a lot of players don't know that you can't activate Widow Anchor onto my Draco Future when I chain to Hayate, because Hayate activates in the damage step after it battles. So the only cards that can activate in the damage step are ones that negate activations. Widow Anchor does not negate activation, it only negates effects. So I think that's happened a few times because people will attack with Hayate and then scoop immediately when I take their card with Draco Future. That's not what happens here. He adds the Afterburner, and then he Afterburners my Draco Future. Again, he didn't read the card. But, you know, Striker players being Striker players, they never really get punished for it. He ends up drawing into the Kaiju off of what's it called? The Metal Foes Fusion that he shuffled back into the deck. He has the Ray in hand already. He goes into Kagari, and then here he does something strange. Instead of adding back the Mobilize Engage again, he adds back the Afterburner. And then he Afterburners my cards. But the cool thing about the Zoo cards and the Draco cards is that they all have, or like the Ram and the others, and Apocalypse, they both have graveyard effects that trigger here. So we get to clear the Kagari for free. And then the Ram gets to special summon back the Thoroughblade. So if my opponent wants to go into battle phase, they have to go into the Shizuku. Instead, he goes for the Hayate, so he can attack directly to dump a card. I think he ends up dumping a Rose from his deck to grave. Yeah, he dumps a Rose, which if he had gone for Shizuku, he could have cleared my Thoroughblade. But then he still just at the end of his turn gets to Shizuku, add back a card. He gets to Ray float if I kill the Shizuku. So I'm not really out of the woods yet. Even if I go for something like Zeus, it's not the greatest for me because if I Zeus my own cards, I don't get a lot of advantage. So I just decide not to do that. Instead, I go for the Tribute Summon for Ignis that I drew for turn. My Disciples on the field is going to shuffle all of my resources back into the deck and draw me a card. And now at this point, we're going to go for some very basic plays, very simple plays. All of my monsters are bigger than the Striker cards, so I can just play a similar game to Striker where they want to go +1 on every interaction that they do. And now with the Draco cards, I also get to go +1 on every interaction. Anytime they do something, Ignis is going to get a search. Anytime I Tribute Summon for something, it's going to pop a card on his field. Or it's going to shuffle back my resources and draw one. Or it's going to it's going to draw me cards for the number of cards that I sent to the graveyard, or it's going to special summon back a True Draco card from the grave. So very similar to Striker, all of my cards have like free inherent +1s in them. The Zoo engine here is not like it generates some interruptions. You see we get the Ignis effect, which is going to give me a +1 on my turn because he wants to use the effect of Ray. He goes for his Kaina here, probably a little bit unnecessary. I think it would have been better just to take the damage. But, you know, he uses up his Kaina here. And then I go for Heritage. I've tributed a card this turn, so this Heritage generates another resource. So it's like resource into free resource into free resource. And now we have the Droplets as well. So if he tries to go for something else, we can Droplets that. But he does have the Hey Trunade. But with the Hey Trunade, that triggers our Draco Future. And now here we get to do something cool with our Drytron, because we know he had the Widow Anchor from the previous turn, I believe. We get to activate the effect of Ignis. When he goes to negate its effect and steal it, we can actually, we get to pop it with our Drytron, which we have to do here, mostly because the Ignis can just attack over the Drytron anyway to force it out. So we might as well resolve it to get our search, because there's no way the Ignis lives through this turn. Whether he summons like something from his hand, links into Zeke, outs another card, so it wasn't great for us. And of course, you know, he had the Ray in circulation again. So he goes Hayate, attacks, but at this point, he's kind of used up all of his good Striker names. All of his good Striker spells are engraved. He used up his Kagari. He wasn't able to establish with multi-roll. So even though this Hayate is on the field, it doesn't actually float in more resources. The Shizuku search will get him something at end phase, but at this point, if we look at our field, we've gotten what? We had their Ignis. The Ignis cleared a monster on his field, baited out his Kaina, and then also searched us has searched us 2 cards at this point, and the card it searched us has generated a +1. So off this Ignis alone, we've gone like +2 or +3 so far. And then we drew another Ignis in hand. We get to Tribute Summon again, and just keep putting the pressure on with these big monsters, where like the normal Zoo deck, we might have run out of follow-up by now, because if you look at our graveyard, we've used 1, 2, 3, 4. We've used our Draco engine. We've used a lot of our Zoo cards. We still have like a Chuck-K9. If this was a pure Zoo deck, we would still have like a Tiger Mortar, so we go like Chalk Drytron. But that's really not enough to even deal with Shizuku Pass in this case. So we would have had to commit our entire extra deck just to make the Zeus. But because we're playing Draco, we don't have to do that. We have a bunch of big monsters on the field that pressure the Striker cards on their own. The Bee is stuck, the Ignis sticks, and you just keep attacking. You keep getting free advantage every turn from your Draco spells and traps. So even though our opponent didn't play the best, we were able to, because they still drew well, they were still in the game. However, because we're playing Draco instead of pure Zoo, we still we have the ability to kind of push through their extra resources. And as you can see, we kind of end the game here with like 10 cards in hand. I missed lethal here. I forgot to use the droplets to lower the effective attack of Shizuku, and that would have been game if I had just calculated a little better, just giving him no opportunity to get back in this game. But they go for Avarice. But we've been drawing cards off of all of our different Draco effects. So we've drawn into our Ash Blossom, which we use to negate the Avarice, which stops him from getting back into the game. And then from here, from here, I think he still has, yeah, he goes for my Draco. I get my Ignis. This is like Ignis number 3 or 4 for this game. So we've just added so many free cards from our deck to our hands. And then I think here he goes into, he goes into Access Code, or he's trying to go into his Access play line. But we have, you know, the Forbidden Droplets to stop it. I let him go into his Halka Fibrax, and then I let him go into his Selene, mostly to let him get his spell counter mission done, because you get there's like a secret mission where you have spell counters. But when I negate the Selene, he ends up quitting the duel, so he doesn't get it. But yeah, that's basically it for this game. This kind of just shows you that if a Draco monster sticks, it generates a ton of advantage, and your zoo cards kind of float back and have powerful things they put on the board, like Trident multiple times, the Draco Future, which is hard to out unless they see exactly like a negate plus a kaiju, or a negate or a kaiju or negate plus another out. So yeah, overall, very strong boards that you can end on. The Draco cards give you bigger bodies that you can use to continuously put pressure on throughout the game. So this next game is against Eldlich. Unfortunately, the replay that I wanted to show, I didn't save of my duel against Eldlich. Draco has a pretty solid matchup against Eldlich. Your stuff is big, so you can pressure Golden Lords, unless they were to summon Golden Lord by the summon back special effect. You're playing Spell and Traps that get to pop back row for free, so you don't lose inherently to skill drain like the other variant, like Pure Zoo does. Pure Zoo kind of loses to skill drain unless you see exactly back row removal, but we have a ton of access to back row removal in this version of the deck, because we have the Draco spells and traps, which we contribute over. And then also just being able to tribute spells and traps to pop back row is really good. We still have good board pressure that we keep on. True Draco Apocalypse halves the Eldlich, the big Eldlich boss monster, or Eldlich the Golden Lord, when he's summoned back by his effect. So we basically get to take away that pressure that they can put on with that card as well, which is really powerful. Yeah, and then overall, we also plus off of them activating all of their cards as well, so we should be able to keep pace with Eldlich reasonably well. I know that Pure Draco can sometimes struggle to keep pace with Eldlich, but with the Zoo cards, we can do big blowout plays like go into Zeus or make Trident to pop like their conks when they try to special summon to interrupt our plays. So overall, I think this does have a good Eldlich matchup as well. Starting off, we go for Diagram, popping the Majesty Maiden because we opened a lot of monsters. That's the thing about the Draco deck. If you open a lot of monsters, your hands can be kind of awkward. But at the end of this turn, we still have access to a Trident, and we still have access to Apocalypse, Tribute Summoning for Dynamite on our opponent's turn, which is basically 2 interruptions plus a Nibiru. At this point, I don't know what I'm playing against. He's playing Eldlich. So he goes for Cursed Eldland. I'm like, shoot. Wait for him to pay the 800 life points, and then I have to Trident pop it. Even though he gets to send a card to grave off of this, you kind of have to deal with the Cursed Eldland right away, because if I don't, if this stays on the field, it's going to get a +1 every turn. It's going to get a +1 when I inevitably send it to graveyard, or when he inevitably sends it to grave. So it kind of forces me to pop it here. There's not, knowing I'm playing Eldlich, there's not really anything great on the first turn of the game to pop, because if they go Golden Lord Send like he just did here and special summon it, it's immune to destruction effects. So my Apocalypse is dead, my Trident is dead, and we're just kind of sitting here. So he goes Battle Phase, walks over my Zoo. I'm like, darn, this kind of sucks. This Nibiru in hand is going to be popped on the next turn. He goes up and sets his plays. I know only Sanguine, none of the other cards, I believe. And then I draw a Zoo per turn. I'm like, oh, perfect, this is great. Because I'm able to pressure the back row here. I go for Heritage. I'm going to activate the Heritage. And when I activate the Heritage, this is where things get a little bit funky and this replay gets a little bit out of hand, because this guy clicks the wrong buttons. But he summons Conk and targets his own Golden Lord, which cannot be destroyed. I think he just misclicked here. But my goal was to activate Heritage, to tribute over Heritage for Dynamite Knuckle, so that way I could pop one of his back row, and then Dynamite effect will trigger most likely when he goes to do something to my Dynamite to get me a True King's Return, and then that way I'm set up for my opponent's turn to like use Apocalypse plus Return, or I could just commit to the Zoo play and see if I could stick the Zeus and then kind of hope for the best. Honestly, I was in a pretty not great position because he has a lot of back row for me to contend with. We're going to probably go into a slow roll game. Even with this misplay where he targets his own Eldlich the Golden Lord, I think he's still in a really good spot because he has Sanguine, this can't be destroyed, 3 other unknown back rows, which, looking at his deck profile, he's playing real traps. But yeah, no, he just, the effect resolves and he concedes. Like I said, this isn't the Eldlich match I wanted to show. There was another one that was a little bit better, had a little more back and forth, that showed off the Draco stuff. Unfortunately, I didn't save it in time, so I kind of wanted to touch on the notes of this matchup in particular, because Eldlich is everywhere on the ladder. And you might see it in the Xyz Cup if it doesn't get banned. For this next duel, we're going second against Drytron. Luckily for us, our opponent doesn't open too broken. I think he actually bricked here. On my turn, I could feel that he had the Herald of Orange Light in his hand, based on the delays that he was activating, but there was never really a great card that was going to get him a ton of value off of it. So he kind of just goes for some advantage here in the beginning, sets up his double delta. It looks like he opened double delta, and that was like the why he couldn't really pop off, because he didn't have access to Alpha or Nova. However, we start playing. The Draco matchup actually has a pretty good matchup against this deck, because you can set a trap, tribute summon over it with one of your Draco cards, and the trap will actually pop the Herald of Ultimateness, and the Herald of Ultimateness cannot protect itself from your trap popping, because Herald of Ultimateness only negates the activations of spells and traps, or the effects of monsters. So basically, this kind of gets around it, where it's really easy to out that card, and then potentially go into other plays as well. The only problem is you commit your normal summon to the turn on that, so it's not the greatest thing that you can do, but at least you have more reasonable outs. We also play Forbidden Droplets for that, so that our opponent, we can negate that before going to our other plays. We go in for the Zeus here, because I kind of want to just clear the resources from his board. I don't want to commit anything. I don't have anything particularly good to play, because I've only got, I don't have all of the Draco cards, I go for the Max C to hopefully stunt his plays, but he has the Ash for it, so we're like, okay, now we're really just riding or dying on this Zeus, and then we also have, I guess, the Nibiru as well. So I'm like, okay, we should be pretty safe. We should be safe here, and then we can kind of sit back on the next turn, go into a Whiptail, re-equip Bunny Blast maybe, and then have like a big monster, or go B Trident on the next turn. And so once he gets adequate amounts of cards on the field, puts 3 monsters on the field before he can go into like his move to Fafnir or something, I remove his board, force him to commit to the Diviner of Herald, and then from here he sends the Intes, and then the Zeus gets to pop his board. And then I believe, yeah, being able to establish the Zeus into the Drytron board where they're before they're able to establish anything really kind of stopped him from playing the game. From here, we get our Thoroughblade. We draw for Thoroughblade for turn. I don't know how good it was to discard that Whiptail. Might have been better to hold it. But we did draw an Ash, so I guess it's okay. But now we don't have follow-up for the turn after this one if our board gets outed. But basically, we get to go for Trident, Chakanine, or Trident plus the Vespinato to just put some light damage on and sit back. Honestly, here it might have been better to set to activate the True Draco or the Disciples and then set the Apocalypse, just in case. Like on my opponent's turn, I wanted to like have their attack so he couldn't get rid of my Vespinato. But thankfully, we drew into the Ash for the Delta to stop his first summon, forcing him to have another card in hand to play, which he doesn't have. So he just surrenders the duel there. Even though he had access to more Drytrons in grave, he just wasn't able to play. If you're able to break the Drytron boards and establish the Zeus, it's really hard for Drytron to play after that, because you can Zeus their board before they can really commit to anything else. The exception to that is kind of if they already have the Herald in rotation, they already have the and they have added back the Meteonish Drytron, maybe they can summon back the Herald before they commit to their other plays. But then they've already used the Meteonish Drytron effect that turn to add it back to hand, and then special summon the Herald. So even if they have like one negate, you might be able to just double Zeus the Herald to still wipe the board after you've like kind of depleted their resources. I think this is a key reason why also you want to play Max or Nibiru if you're playing Max C, at least one copy of it. Because in the Drytron matchup, if you Max C them and you have nothing, it doesn't really matter. In our deck, we have inherent outs to their board, but in other decks, like if you're not main decking the Droplets or a Kaiju for ladder, Drytron is really rough, and I would recommend playing one of those 2 cards in your main deck for sure to beat this deck. And the last duel I wanted to show for today was my one loss that I had while I was playing this deck. This kind of goes to show you that like there's hands where you don't open well. Like I only opened Zoo cards, I got Max Seed, which really in Zoo it's not that bad to get Max Seed. As you see, I had the Ash for it, I just didn't negate it because I was like there's no point to. I'm just gonna go into a Trident and pass my turn over to my opponent. We see we drew a Draco card, so in my mind I'm like, okay, if this tanky lives, I'm doing okay for the next turn. But the main weakness of this deck is if and then Feather Duster's me activates multi-roll. I'm like, shoot, that sucks. And then he activates engage. I'm like, shoot, that sucks. I need to Ash that. Is if you only see some of your engine and they get called by the grave for Ash. And this duel was just really rough for me. The opponent so far has kind of just had everything. They had the Max C, they had the Duster for my 1 back row, they had the called by for my Ash. And this, I think, shows why people hate playing against Striker mostly, is that sometimes they kind of just have it, you know? So he goes into battle phase to attack over my Trident. I'm forced to pop the multi-roll because otherwise he's going to get value off of it because he engaged this turn. He goes Hayate effect. I don't know what he dumps. He dumps the Rose, which I don't necessarily understand why the Striker players all do this. Because like it makes it so that your follow-up turns are a little worse because you have fewer cards you can draw into to get your engine started again. But he's got Kagari to add back the engage, plus the 3 spells engraved that he already had, so he gets to engage, add multi-roll, draw an additional card off of engage. And then interestingly enough, he goes into Shizuku, but he doesn't do the Shizuku shuffle at end phase. So this is, he does add the Widow Anchor, so I thought he was going to do it. So this is actually something really broken about this game with Striker right now. Striker actually gets better when they fix the game. Is that normally you get to choose the order of your end phase effects. So you can say, I would like to activate the effect of Shizuku first, resolve to add multi-roll, add a Widow Anchor, and then you Widow Anchor your own Shizuku, which gives you another activation on multi-roll. So multi-roll can reset back the Widow Anchor that you set. However, the way that it works right now is that multi-roll will actually ask you if you want to use its effect first during the end phase, if it had seen valid targets previously during that turn. So for example, if I had not outed the first multi-roll, and this had stayed on the field, and he could have set engage back to the his multi-roll would have procced, asked him to set engage back to the field, and then he could have Shizuku effect to add a second copy of engage. But he wouldn't have been able to use, like, he wouldn't have been able to add the Widow Anchor, activate the Widow Anchor, and then reset the Widow Anchor. However, if your multi-roll has not seen any cards activate this turn, you can actually activate the effect of Shizuku to add the Widow Anchor, then activate the Widow Anchor to target your own Shizuku. And now, because multi-roll has a valid card that it can reset because it's seen in activation, the prompt will then come up to allow you to reset the Widow Anchor. So if you guys are playing Striker and you didn't know that, you can do Shizuku Shuffle exclusively when you have a multi-roll that hasn't seen any activations yet that turn. And I think that would have been really good for my opponent to do. I think this, like, it ends up being irrelevant, you'll see why, but this, like, kind of shuts me out of the game because he puts the Widow Anchor down. He's got three spells engraved, so he can steal whatever I start with. Like, if I start a zoo monster, he can just take it and I can't do anything about it. Yeah, and then he gets to reset engage back on the next turn, and even though with the engage set, he still has 3 spells engraved, which allows him to engage, search, draw 1, and it would have gotten out of hand really fast if he had done the Shizuku Shuffle on this. But you'll see, at this point, he's kind of drained my resources because he's had outs for all of my cards that forced everything. I draw the Nibiru for turn, I'm like, shoot, this is dead against this matchup. They don't really do that much special summoning outside of exclusively when they go for those other Nibiru or access code plays. He has the Veiler for my Borbo, so I'm like, oh, that sucks. I can't go into the 6-mat Zeus. So I go Tiger Mortar, I Tiger Mortar effects, detach, and then re-equip the Thoroughblade, and he negates again. I'm like, darn, that sucks. I can't go into a 4-mat Zeus now. And so I go into Chalkanine, and I'm forced to special summon back the Borbo, and then I go battle phase, attack into, crash, so that I have an Xyz monster that's battled this turn, so that I can go into Zeus. And I end up not using Zeus on my own turn. Maybe that was a little bit of a misplay. I didn't want to out his Shizuku on my turn just for him to special summon back the Ray, to then go into another copy of Shizuku to search another card. Like, it outs the multi-roll, but that's all it does. And then he's got, like, he has whatever he wants for next turn. I know that he has the Anchor in hand for follow-up, so I know that the Anchor is going to get baited, or bait my stuff right away. What I'm hoping he's going to do is blind Anchor my card, so I can chain in response to out his board. But in my mind, I know that if he goes multi-roll, target Shizuku, I have to chain the Zeus, because otherwise I just lose out on free. I lose out here. So he does it, and I chain in response, and then he Widow Anchor takes my card. At this point in my head, I'm like, okay, we're okay here as long as he doesn't have the other copy of Ray in hand. And of course, being the ladder striker player that he is, he normal summons Ray and attacks me with my Zeus, and attacks me with his Ray, tags it out, and attacks for game. So this kind of goes to show you, if you have, like, sometimes more awkward hands where you don't get to see your Draco stuff early on, which hurts you. You don't see a high enough amount of Draco cards in your hand, so maybe it's worth cutting back on some of the Zeus stuff a little bit to add maybe the 3rd copy of Return or the 3rd copy of Disciple, maybe so you just see them more consistently. But there's just going to be some games like this where your opponent sees, you know, engage, multi-roll, double Veiler, called by Maxi. Like, it happens on the ladder, and, like, it's important to not beat yourself up over these games too much. You kind of have to reflect and ask yourself, like, okay, what could I have done better given the circumstance? But ultimately know that in this case, sometimes games are just kind of unwinnable on ladder. I think typically, like I said in a previous duel, this has a pretty decent striker matchup if you do end up seeing more of your Draco cards. But if you don't see those Draco cards early and you just see the Zoo cards, it's hard to get your advantage engine going, and it can be where you lose some of your games. Because drawing into Draco cards on an empty hand are not the greatest. You typically need like 2, maybe 3 cards to kind of get started with the engine and get the snowball rolling. But once the Draco engine stuff gets the snowball rolling, it plays very effectively, very well, gets you advantage every turn, and is overall, I think, has a pretty solid matchup across the board. I think, like I said in the deck profile towards the end, this is a good option for the Xyz Cup, because a lot of the stuff that other Xyz decks lose to, like floodgates that are targeted towards Xyz, like Flying Sea, Forbidden Apocrypha, Xyz Universe, Dimension Barrier, all really hurt your Zoo engine. And in those cases, you have to really fall back on the traps that you play in the deck. However, with the Draco cards, you can still play aggressively, even on the turns where you've been Xyz, or where you have been like Dimension Barrier, where you've been Flying Seed. It's easier to out the Flying Sea because you can just tribute over the Flying Sea, or you can diagram pop the Flying Sea, or you can tribute over a trap card and pop your Flying Sea, which doesn't make sense in most cases, but if you want to put something in the graveyard for the Heritage draw or the Disciples draw, those come up. Being able to cycle your resources and thinking like, okay, is there a way for me to get the second Heritage draw this turn? Is that worth the resource that I'm trading for it? And if you have a Disciple in hand, it maybe is, because if you get if you clear 2 of your own cards, to get the draw 2 off of Heritage, and then you Disciples, that's another draw, plus you put your resources back. This deck has just a lot of flexibility with what it can do. The play lines, I don't think, are overly complex. You kind of just put big beaters on the board that trade well and gain you advantage. That being said, if you guys have any questions about any of the gameplay you saw, or any questions about the deck in general, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer any questions or comments that you might have. And let me know what you guys are planning on playing for the Xyz Cup. I'm pretty excited for the event. I have one more deck that I'm kind of like building, but it's a little bit janky. I don't know how good or how stable or consistent it really is for the Xyz Cup. I might end up playing a few games with it. We'll see. I'm still deciding. That being said, I hope you all have enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.